Hi, welcome to the fourth seminar of the Aphasia CRE Seminar series. I'm Michelle Attard from the University of Sydney, co-facilitator of the seminar series. I'd like to begin by paying my respect and acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. We warmly welcome you near and far. We're delighted to have Associate Professor Emma Power as our seminar speaker today. Before I introduce Emma, I'd like to cover some housekeeping. Please be patient and bear with us as we gather many attendees via many Zoom links. Apologies in advance if there are any disruptions to your viewing during the seminar, as some attendees might join in late via Zoom. Please mute your microphone, turn off your video and minimise the Zoom gallery. This will enhance everybody's Zoom experience. Thanks for that. So as mentioned, the seminar is being recorded on Zoom and it will be available via the Aphasia CRE website. All you have to do is click on the resources tab. Videos are usually uploaded 1 to 2 weeks after each seminar, and seminars 1 to 3 have already been uploaded to view. So questions for this seminar will be aided by the use of Slido. You can log in anonymously or with your name, and you'll be able to see all questions put forward by other audience members. Give it a go. It's a great way to engage with the presentation and allows you to ask questions online, so then you can keep listening as you go. Our event code is 2509, so just type that in and you can join. Enter your questions under the questions tab at any time. And if you're particularly fond of a question, give it a thumbs up so that it gets pushed up to the top. Emma will answer as many questions as time allows, but other questions will be video recorded and added to the webinar recording. And please engage with us as well on social media via Twitter and Facebook. Feel free to tweet along today at our hashtag @AphasiaCRE. So, without any further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Associate Professor Emma Power. Emma's an Associate Investigator of the Aphasia CRE. She's a speech pathologist and academic at the University of Technology, Sydney. Emma has worked in the area of communication disorders following acquired brain injury for over 23 years in a variety of clinical settings and academic positions as well. She's led research on best practice guidelines for post-stroke aphasia, developed efficacious communication partner training programs, and has a wealth of knowledge around implementation science. Emma is a member of the interdisciplinary Sydney Sexuality group. The group's program of research spans synthesis on the literature on sexuality and intimacy post-stroke, barriers, facilitators and current practice, and co-design of a sexuality education intervention for inpatient post-stroke settings. A key feature of the group's work is the inclusion of people with communication impairments in the studies as part of the larger stroke group. Today, Emma will be discussing the topic of sexuality and intimacy, post-stroke and aphasia. Thank you so much, Emma.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. What we have today is we have my colleagues in the room from the Graduate School of Health, and also obviously several people online, so thank you very much for coming. Today, what I wanted to do is acknowledge that I don't really feel like I'm a sexuality expert as such. I'm part of a team where we're developing our expertise in that area. My role in the team is that I am someone who is facilitating the inclusion of people with communication impairments, and I acknowledge my very, very knowledgeable partners in Sandra Lever, who's a clinical nurse consultant and runs a sexuality clinic. Oh, that's interesting noise. Calling me. Oh, thank you. Lovely. And also Margaret McGrath, who's an occupational therapist at the University of Sydney. Annie McCluskey is also an occupational therapist. and I'm acknowledging Michelle Lowe, who's an honours student who's done the studies that we're working on. The funding sources include the Stroke Foundation, New South Wales ACI and the University of Sydney.
If everybody could just please mute their microphones, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
All right, so what I wanted to talk about today, and it's not comprehensive, it's an overview of sexuality definitions and background, current practice and perspectives, including the barriers and facilitators to working in the area, starting difficult conversations, and they are really very difficult for people, interventions and outcome measures, although there's not a lot of outcome measures that are actually being validated and psychometrically tested for stroke. And then I'll finish with some key messages, and I've got some key references and resources at the end. So I'll try and I'm covering stroke more generally. The reason is that the way that I'm working in this project is it's not a project for me about aphasia, it's a project about stroke, of which people with communication impairments are one key component of that group. And so I'll refer to communication where it's relevant, but I'll be talking more broadly. Again, it's centred on our program of research, so there is some research out there. We're doing quite a bit of it at the moment, but it's just meant to be our pathway, our research program of what we're trying to achieve. Okay. So the first thing is sexuality definitions and background. If you read some of the articles, you would actually think that sexuality is only one thing, and that is sexual function. But the WHO describes it as a central aspect of being human throughout life that encompasses sex, gender identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy, and last of all, reproduction. It's influenced by a very complex interaction of biological, psychological, social, economic, political, cultural, ethical, historical, religious and spiritual factors, which is part of what makes this a difficult area to work in and difficult for people with stroke. Because of this complexity and interplay of factors, it's effectively a taboo topic for the broader society, but that doesn't mean it's not valued and that people aren't thinking it's important. It just means the expression of that is very difficult. So we know that sexuality is important for quality of life for many stroke survivors and their partners. And when I'm talking about sexuality, I might mean any way that people express intimacy. It doesn't have to be sex itself. It could be, like we've said, gender roles, feeling like you're feminine, feeling like you look good, and as well as, you know, the closeness that you can feel to other people. Up to 50% of stroke survivors report less frequent sexual activity. So again, a lot of the research is around that. And 70% of couples report sexual dissatisfaction. There's a focus on penetrative sex. I will say this is often because point 3 there is that it's often about men. The sexual response cycle and sexual dysfunction. But there is more to it than that, and people with aphasia are often excluded because you need to talk about what you think about those things, and if you can't talk about it, then you're often excluded from the studies. Culturally and linguistically diverse populations are not often involved in the studies, and sexual minorities are often absent. It often includes more men in the literature, and young stroke survivors are absent despite the fact that the stroke incidence rate for young people is increasing, and there's the importance of planning for children. So I had a colleague whose niece had a stroke in her 20s, and she went home thinking that she would never ever be able to have a family because it wasn't even addressed. So that was quite confronting for her, but it seemed like just a fait accompli. That was just what it was, and that's how it was. So now we're looking at what is the current practice and perspectives from people who are consumers, but also clinicians. And so this is just a question for you, and it's really not, it's really rhetorical in a way, and just thinking about what you know, or but you know, does your service have a policy or protocol for discussing sexuality and intimacy if you're in stroke? you know, in multidisciplinary teams. And even if you do you audit it to check that you are doing the things that we're meant to be doing, and who actually has initiated. So a lot of people don't work here clinically in this particular area, but you know, you might even look at parallels for other hard conversations you have to initiate and how much you avoid that or you do that. Another area I feel like is palliative care is another area that's hard, talking about dying and things like that too. But I feel like that's actually more acceptable to talk about dying than it is to talk about sex. So what is best practice meant to look like? The evidence base is still quite embryonic, but there is a clear sense in the Australian stroke guidelines and across the world that stroke survivors and partners should be offered the opportunity to discuss sexual intimacy and provided with written information addressing that. That's offered the opportunity to discuss. Doesn't mean we have to make them discuss it. It's about their informed choice. But sometimes it's very hard for people to make that choice if they're not aware in a hospital that this stroke may actually impact on this. So we kind of have to educate people in order for them to make that informed choice about do they want to know more. Okay. So what does best practice actually look like then if we've got the stroke audit? Do you think that 80% of people were provided with written information and the opportunity to discuss? 65, 40, 20? What do you reckon? Oh, it was too obvious. I should have randomised these things. So the stroke audit, which is, you know, pretty recent, 2018, actually is a 5 or 3% increase on the 2016 one. So we are heading in the right direction at the snail's pace. And there was a rehab audit of 120 services, 9,000 admissions. And so the way that the Stroke Foundation has messaged this is that 80% of people were not given information about intimacy after stroke. Okay. So what are the perspectives of stroke survivors and partners then? What we did is we went, okay, well, we could do a big study looking at and recruit all these people, but there's a lot of stuff in the literature. There's a lot of qualitative studies. So our first point of call was to say, well, based on what people have already done, let's do a meta-synthesis of qualitative papers in the area to understand how sexuality after stroke is experienced by stroke survivors and by partners of stroke survivors. So, and we note here that we deliberately tried to use the WHO broad definition of sexuality so that it wasn't confined to sexual function. And we included people with communication impairments, which means we had to use search terms that actively tried to include those people to see if we could get articles that actually had them as part of the participant group. The perspectives came from 649 stroke survivors of the 43 studies. There were 1 person to 125 per study, 60% were male, age range between 20 to 105. There were 267 partners that inputted this, you know, gave us perspectives from 31 to 90 years. Most include heterosexual coupled stroke survivors in Western contexts. I can't remember if there was some studies from Turkey and some other places, but generally it was Western contexts and often Scandinavia. And we did some quality assessment too. But people with, so my interest was like, okay, then I went through and tried to map how much people with communication impairment were represented within this. We know people with aphasia represent up to 30% of people who've had a stroke, but people with right hemisphere damage and cognitive communication problems can be up to 80%. So of the 43 studies, 16 excluded people with communication impairments. Remember, these are qualitative studies that are talking studies. And so that might have been, you know, why they had done that. But 11 out of 43 had no mention of communication. So it was like they didn't exist at all. So 2/3 didn't have people with communication impairment represented in their perspectives, even though they make up at least 1/3 to more than that of the population. This is a phenomenon that, for those of you who are not as familiar with aphasia, is across the board in stroke studies. 6 out of 43 did target people with communication impairment specifically to look at relationships, but only 1 focused on intimacy and sexuality. 10 out of 43 did not exclude people, except people with severe impairments, and there was some description of participants, and they were usually people with aphasia and apraxia. There was no mention of cognitive communication impairments, even though the majority of the people I noted had right hemisphere lesions, which would mean that they were expected to be presenting with some of those interpersonal type communication difficulties, which certainly could impact on that as well, on that aspect of life. So the 2 major themes were central to the experience of sexuality and after stroke. Sexuality is silenced, and sexuality is still important, but it's muted and sometimes changed, not forgotten. So we had things like, and the asterisk means that the study had people with communication impairments in it. No, we don't talk about such things. We talk about practical matters. We never tell each other how we feel. We can't do that. I say nothing. I never tell him anything. None of the couples were asked about sexuality during the rehabilitation process in this study. This is the aphasia study. Most couples wanted to be asked about their experience. And with people with communication impairments, I sort of called it the silence within the silence. So there's already silence, and then you have a communication impairment on top of that. So participants with aphasia reported it was harder to verbally initiate and talk about a desire for sex and intimacy, while their spouses reported that their partner with aphasia was no longer able to express their feelings or engage in any sexually intimate conversation. Okay. At a societal level, there's things about gender roles. I mean, for some of these people, it's like just about looking in the mirror and having trouble, about their changed bodies, and what they think they're meant to be in society and their identity. So this person said, you're supposed to be pretty straight and macho, and I miss being that, okay? And this person in Sandra's study said, I will totally understand if men don't find me physically or like sexually attractive anymore because I am disabled. But stroke doesn't change the essence of who I am or what I want, it just changes what I can do. And then you have the relationship change between partners. I became like a mum to him. I was helping him with everything, which is not terribly intimate sometimes in the sexy sense. But then you have these as well, these quotes, which I must admit are few and far between, but still, I would say it's been for the better. It was good before, but it's really good now because it's very tender and loving. The sexual life has improved. I feel like you have to take care of it and enjoy life. So perhaps a re-evaluation of a relationship and what it means to have that opportunity is involved in that, which often people find with, you know, catastrophic events like stroke and trauma. So most stroke survivors would be thinking about how they look and feel about their relationships. It's going on in their heads. Professionals need to provide opportunities and give permission to talk about sexuality, roles and relationships, and not just function, as you saw from those quotes. So this is my little annotation here, basically what I think is going on. So we're waiting for patients to ask something taboo and hard that we find taboo and hard ourselves, kind of really hoping that they don't. Because what will we say and do and who we will refer to anyway? We don't have pathways that are clear to us about where we send people. And so they don't ask, and neither do we. But they still have to live, adjust and experience their difficulties alone. What I didn't show you there is all the quotes that talked about the resignation of the loss of intimacy. It was just like, oh, well, that was just meant to happen after a stroke. Nothing I can do about it. So they, everyone is silent and silenced, especially if you've got communication difficulties. And this is just an example of a Facebook site that we have permission to put some information up. And you can see here people are, the question is, was anyone scared here that they would not have sex again or be in a relationship? And someone's sex drive has hit its peak and everything is much better. It was awkward at first because of the numbness. So people are finding their bodies different. Took time to learn each other again. But now it's the best it's ever been. So for those who are still hopeful, it's possible to have an amazing sex life after a stroke, amazing life period. But then you've got this other idea. My boyfriend broke up with me after stroke, stayed with me as long as I was in hospital and then broke up with me. So yes, I feel unlovable. And again, that's not necessarily about sex, it's a relationship. I thought he would have been scared as ever, because the stroke for this person happened while they were having sex. But nope, it's the same and sometimes better. So they are finding support in each other if we're not going to do it. And so one of the barriers and facilitators, I mean, obviously it's us as part of that equation, and we are part of a bigger society. You may have seen recently the NDIS story about a person with MS who was refused initially sexual therapy. And by that I mean counselling, not a sex worker. And because that would be just even further too far. And so she won a right on appeal. And what Minister Stuart Roberts said is that having things like sexual therapy is not in line with community expectations of what is reasonable and necessary supports for that person to participate in. So I've got down there, strongly disagree, disagree, undecided, agree, strongly agree. So how do you feel about that? I suspect that there is actually quite a range of opinions about that in society, depending on who you are and what you believe. Sorry, I'm just managing that bit there. So values, beliefs and behaviour are really critical to this. You know, the first one there I think says that it's too hard to talk to stroke survivors with aphasia about sexuality. So that's what I've heard, but it's too hard, so we won't. Actually, it is hard. You're right, it's hard. Discussions about sexuality are best conducted by professionals who can talk comfortably about the topic, but not me. It is the role of nurses to talk about sexuality. Everyone goes, oh, it's not my role, it's the other person's role, or nurses. Stroke survivors and their partners don't need information about sexuality unless they ask for it. And older stroke survivors do not require information about sexuality. So I was talking to one of my colleagues the other day in my team, and she said, you know, imagine this scenario where you've got someone on the stroke ward who's 90, they're going to residential care, do you even bring it up? Strongly agree, disagree, undecided. So you've got that same idea about people will fall on the spectrum there with agreeance and disagreeance, because the values and beliefs and behaviour come from all of those complex things we talked about in the definition. So we said, oh, okay, what are professionals? What are their attitudes and beliefs and practices like in relation to this? And we examined again the literature. You'll understand why in a minute. We've gone to the literature first rather than studies with lots of people. And so we looked at the literature around chronic disability, asking people, do they routinely, usually, regularly, you know, always ask about sexuality? And in the 24 studies we had, it was about 22%, which actually sounds a bit like the stroke guideline data as well. So again, it's a very low number of people that are willing to do that. Health professionals' beliefs, again, the patient will tell you if they want to discuss it. It's only a problem if the patient sees it as a problem. Surely, I think unless they actually bring it up with you, then why would you do it? Someone else should do it, not me. We've said that. I think you sort of expect someone else to do it rather than yourself. And it's not an essential aspect of rehabilitation. So that's an issue of prioritisation. It's seen as optional and reported the frequency of discussion is varied by support coordinators. So in this instance, what they're saying is it depends on what else is happening. And for some conditions, the medical aspect of being in hospital, you know, and care and life is the priority. And so it's very hard for people to actually say, oh, now we'll just sit down and talk about something very, very psychosocial that actually might be in the future. Okay. Behaviour, a lot of people took indirect opportunities for discussion. I would also always ask about relationships at home. I'd always ask about social circumstances, but I wouldn't necessarily ask about the sexual side of the relationship. So again, that's that silencing. We'll talk about everything but that, which tells the person they're not to raise it. Okay. And this last one is kind of blatant. We avoid it at all costs. We don't have the skills and it's embarrassing. And let's face it, it is kind of awkward, isn't it? Like, it's not really like, what's your garden like topic. It's actually quite challenging. So yeah, I just sort of skimmed over laughter from others. The subject. and change the subject, which must be actually a very demoralising thing to have a professional do. So occupational therapy is one of the professions that we might associate with this area quite a bit. And Margaret's done some work in looking at why has so little progress been made in the practice in occupational therapy in relation to sexuality. And again, it's about education. I mean, I don't remember getting anything in uni. Do you remember getting anything? Some of you, it would be less relevant, some more. Discomfort, it's not important or not a priority. People are not sure of what to say or do. There's no clear intervention. It's really hard to approach this topic when you don't really know what you're going to do after you've done that. You might just sit there drowning. And embarrassment. And it's not just an OT challenge, it's an interdisciplinary challenge. In the same way that mental health is, in the same way that many other aspects of good care are. So we had a look too also, we went, okay then, well let's actually use a scale that's been psychometrically validated with properties that potentially are more than just asking people what they think, to understand the perspectives of stroke professionals in terms of their knowledge, comfort, approach-related comfort, and attitudes towards sexuality. And so that would include knowledge is sexual positioning. Comfort might be a male stroke survivor asks, will they ever have children? Approach-related comfort is when people are directly approached in relation to sexuality-based stuff, like how well are you able to brush that off and just move on and deal with it, or is it really something that's quite challenging for you? And attitudes, stroke survivors, do you believe that stroke survivors would find it hard to get a partner? If you had to strongly agree on that thing, the way you then interact with that person will actually take that with it. So this is like the best N I've got in any study that I've done. We've got and it's an honours student, Michelle's work, over 950 clinicians, interdisciplinary clinicians from 5 countries around the world. And I'm going to gleefully talk about the fact that 85% were female, and look at the professional disciplines there. See that blue bar? That's incredible to me because we had an ongoing battle. At one stage, speech pathology was in the lead. And so for some reason, there's been quite a fair response. As much as occupational therapists, and they outnumber us, and technically people would probably consider them to be probably like nurses, pretty key to this area. So I thought that was quite interesting and satisfying. The countries you can see there, obviously we're Australian, and so we've got a lot of people from Australia, but the USA, Canada, United Kingdom, Ireland, Republic of Ireland's an interesting one, some different cultural perspectives and religious perspectives. Singapore again, South Africa and New Zealand. So we tried to get a diverse range of Western but also non-Western contexts that we were able to easily access. And what we found is that in terms of knowledge, comfort, approach, I haven't got all the full stats, we're just writing this up now, and attitudes, there was no difference in attitudes across the professions. Okay, but there was a difference in knowledge, which you might expect, especially physicians and psychologists, along with social workers and nurses felt knowledgeable. Speech pathologists, even though we responded very well to it, seemed to feel the least knowledgeable. Our comfort was quite low compared to some of the others, as was we weren't so worried about the approach, and as I said, the attitudes were very similar. So that was sort of interesting to understand from an interdisciplinary perspective how people were sitting in terms of their knowledge, comfort, approach and attitudes, especially because the literature had said that these are critical things in even opening up a conversation. Sorry that this is a little bit dense, but we're also working at the moment to think if we're going to come up with solutions to some of these challenges, we need to really understand what those barriers are so that we can design tailored interventions that are directly going to address them, not just a scattergun approach. And we need to understand what the facilitators are, like when people do it well or can do it, what is the key to doing that? What's helpful? And so we actually took the systematic review papers and we analysed over 120 papers, I can't remember, it's probably more, using the theoretical domains framework, which is an implementation science theoretical framework of behaviour change. And we found that there's 14 domains. We found that belief in consequences was, I'm just picking one here, the facilitators were that people recognise the importance of sexuality and the importance of giving patients the opportunity to be supported in that, and the belief that some participation in sexuality is really important to patients. So there are people that believe in its importance. It's not that people go, it doesn't matter, though there may be those people too. So this person says, I understand that sexuality is not only sexual intercourse, it's everything, the way people dress, how they act, behaviour. All of this is part of sexuality, very important for wellbeing and self-esteem. Okay, so barriers were fear of embarrassing, offending, upsetting or shocking the patient, particularly older adults, patients who are not in a relationship or people from sexual minorities. Perception that sexuality is less important to some patients depending on their demographics, such as older adults, females, the double whammy of being an older female, single relationship status, the double whammy of being an older single adult, and people from a particular cultural or religious group. So people are making decisions on behalf of other people for them. Obviously, a lot of our elderly gentlemen and ladies don't have sex, obviously. Okay. Which again is part of that wider societal privileging of use in relation to that, and a focus on activity rather than intimacy. So having difficult conversations, I'm just going to move through. There's a model called the Plicit framework, which helps us to, you know, it's a 4-stage model that helps us to actually have almost like a stepped care way to deal with the issue of how do we raise this. And the first thing is, as you've seen, that people are not giving people permission. So the first thing to do in this is to give people permission. And the second level is limited information. The third is specific suggestions, and these are all considered brief interventions that are often issue-based. And then the IT is the intensive therapy. It's probably the specialist that does that. Okay. And so in initiating discussion about sexuality, like we found that, you know, obviously setting and confidentiality is important. Trying to do it on a ward with 4 beds with a curtain is kind of awkward. I wouldn't answer. Okay. Legitimising the topic says, and I'll show you examples, empowering the person to talk, really speaking to the universality of sexuality, like you're not a weird person if you're worried about this. It's something that makes us human, and the ability to question people about what they need. In terms of, like, you think, well, why don't we just have an assessment tool that helps us to ask these questions, which actually can be quite formal. And for some people, say in an inpatient stroke setting, might be difficult. There are some questionnaires and outcome measures for sexuality, different aspects of that, but not very many have been looked at for the stroke population. And so it may be in those early stages that we're just doing simple things like this. And I know this sounds very basic, but if you consider where our baseline is, it's why. We need to give people scripts, health professional scripts. When people have had a stroke, they often have questions about how a stroke affects their sexuality and relationships. This is an important topic. If you have any questions, you can ask me, which is very different to, I tried to avoid it and ran away. Okay. Be kind to yourself and your partner. Adapting to changes from stroke takes time. Try to focus on yourself as a whole person, not just the parts of your body that have changed. Focus on your strengths as well. So these are all ways to initiate a discussion about sexuality without saying, so how's it going? Okay, which is obviously not an easy, there's only a few patients you could do that with. Some people are concerned about body changes that occur following a stroke and how that impacts on them being intimate with a partner. Is that something that you would want to talk about? So the person can say no, or the person can go no, but realise that that's something that they might need to look out for and that they then can again ask about later. So the power is in the permission, and it's the place we have started from by actually not allowing people permission. So that's why these fairly basic and very elementary things are actually where we're at with our intervention. People with communication impairments may have trouble talking about intimacy and relationships, and we can help support your conversations if you want. Okay. And limited information moves a bit further. Changes to the body image are common after stroke and include feeling less attractive, confident, or fearful about exposing your body. These feelings are normal, but there are things that can be done. For example, it's difficult to have a good body image when you're wearing a hospital gown. Some people don't feel good without makeup, so we could do that. So it's starting to get into limited information, not just permission, but we're starting to talk in more detail about the issues. So the P is for permission, and we are pretty much at permission. And limited information, specific suggestions and intensive therapy. Well, Sandra runs the Sexuality and Intimacy Clinic, and so I suppose it's actually working out what's the pathway for referral. So once we've brought this up, what do we do? Who do we send this person to when they ask us clangers that we don't even have a clue about? So we need to have pathways. We need to have recognised pathways, and Sandra's very long work in this area and highly expert work at the Sexuality Clinic at the Greyway. So that's a good referral site for getting help to help people help themselves in that area. So the interventions then, well, starting difficult conversations is the intervention. That's part of the intervention, but we don't have many. There's two particular studies, and I've got my notes here about these because I want to make sure I represent them well. Targeting sexuality following stroke. There's one from South Korea, which evaluated a brief sexuality intervention with 46 couples using a non-randomised design. They had a 32-page manual, seems quite comprehensive, and a pre-discharge information session delivered by nursing staff, and addressed the impact of stroke on sexual function, counselling about the fear of stroke sexual activity, and strategies to reduce sexual dysfunction, and any questions and concerns. So you can see in terms of the things that some people were worried about, it's a very narrow perspective. And for some people, they wouldn't have worked out very quickly at that stage that they were having sexual activity problems. They might not feel good about how they look. After 1 month, experimental couples reported higher sexual satisfaction and more frequent sexual activity compared to controls. Study limitations include a lack of excessive blinding, a selective sample of married couples aged between 40 and 46 years. It's a nice narrow age, and that is not an old age at all, because I'm 45. Furthermore, the program is not available in English, and so because of our lack of Korean, we had a bit of trouble working out what was in it. In Australia, Sansom and colleagues developed a sexuality intervention based on the South Korean example, delivered by a rehabilitation consultant, and it was a pilot randomised trial with 12 people, so again, a small study. They found no between group differences after 6 weeks in sexual functioning, mood or quality of life after receiving a 30-minute intervention with the National Stroke Foundation Sex After Stroke fact sheet. It's probably a good fact sheet, but I'm not sure how well, what we could have reasonably expected from that. Study limitations include a focus on sexual activity, and exclusion of participants with communication impairments. So we really need to go back to basics and ask people what they wanted. And so perhaps similarly, we actually embarked on a Delphi study to try and say to people, well, what do you reckon we should include? And we've published that in the journal. That's my best ever altmetric score of 123 or whatever, because Margaret did actually quite a lot of media around that article. So it was an online Delphi survey, and you're going, oh, communication impairment, can we do that online? So I'll talk about that. And the questionnaire was based on previous research and published programs to think about what are the potential topics. And we had 47 statements over 6 categories of what you could include. We also want to know, beyond content, what do you reckon are the best timing? Like, when is the right time to bring this up? How is best to bring it up? And who should bring it up? So we had 30 stroke survivors, of which our aim was to get 30% of people with a communication impairment, which we almost did. 9 researchers, 18 partners of stroke survivors, and 35 clinicians to provide consensus. And at round 2, they were smaller in number, not surprisingly. I had the particular joy of creating a communicatively accessible version of the Delphi study, which was extremely challenging. We had to kind of use supported communication and aphasia accessible formatting to help people to give us their opinion. And they had to do it on a 1 to 7 scale, which everyone did easily on the online version by clicking. And it was quite challenging. These are complex concepts to get across. So we had to, this one, worry about being rejected after stroke. So the person avoids intimate relationships. So what do we do about your worry about being rejected? And then they had to say, how appropriate is that topic to include in the education package? Changes to close and personal relationships, changes to feelings of attraction. My biggest challenge was sexual service providers. They didn't, the Aphasia Institute didn't have a picture for that. And I only could come up with this, and it's pretty embarrassing that I only managed to get that. But you know, it is really hard. It is actually challenging, and I had a laugh with a few people with aphasia about that, but they got what I meant. They got what I meant. And so, you know, so changing the ability to have an orgasm after stroke. So we've got to ask personal things, and people have to be able to say, I want to talk about that. So I won't go into too much detail about the results of that, but the content results, we came up with 18 core topics, which doesn't sound like core. Okay, stroke-related psychological changes, communication issues, and that doesn't mean communication impairment necessarily, but how do I talk about this? Because a lot of people aren't good at that before their stroke. Stroke-related changes in physical function impacting on sexuality, changes in sexual function, which are interestingly quite specific, and general issues relating to sexuality, and cognitive and behavioural changes impacting on sexuality. So they're the things that people thought were appropriate. Resuming sexual activity after stroke, that's a real anxiety-provoking topic for people. Conversations with intimate partners, how do you express this information? The fear of rejection was something that everyone thought was a very important topic to cover. And fatigue, pervasive. Fatigue is actually a pervasive issue. Changes in attraction towards the intimate partner, including changes switching from a carer to being a partner. Loss of function of body parts. I mean, that's kind of part of what a sex is, and intimacy. And the changes to the self-concept and self-esteem and what they thought of themselves. So people were not just saying, how do I have sex activity? They were really being wide about that. I feel these would be relevant to all stroke survivors and partners, and chosen on the basis of the individual's needs. So how do we do 18 core topics for everyone but not everyone? People didn't have apart from not in the first 2 weeks after stroke, people, you can see here, thought it was reasonable to raise it within a month, and preferably around 3 to 6 months. So it was not seen as relevant, well, as appropriate at after a year. It was meant to be before then for a lot of people. And in terms of the professions, no, none of the professions were considered, you know, low in terms of their consensus of their appropriateness. No one got away with it. Okay, speech pathologists were some of the lowest ones, but for the people with communication impairment that I interviewed, and it may be because I was interviewing them rather than doing it online, they put speech pathologists first as the person to help and raise it. And I believe that's one of them said, because you know, and that's about our role having to often be about being an interpreter, being the conduit for that. So we are trying to make a co-design intervention with stroke survivors and partners. We've included people with communication impairment, and at every stage, even in looking at our systematic reviews, we have high levels of consensus for everything, but little discrimination of those topics. We as a team think that do our experts have actually limited expertise? So if you weren't asked about, most of the people were not asked about sex. So a lot of people are answering on a hypothetical. A lot of clinicians haven't raised it, but are thinking what's appropriate. So it's very hard, unless you've been in the space, to make a reasoned decision about the priorities for that. So we went, okay, good, well, we'll try, evaluate the feasibility, acceptability and efficacy. So there was 18 core topics. We have made it into a step care model where there are tier 1 core topics that we will provide scripts for giving permission and limited information, and then there'll be additional supports and referral patterns for the more complex topics and you'll know which ones you might be able to be depth in by the tiers and how they work. Subacute was one of the preferred times, but there's no time limit. I think that's the key, is everyone's not ready in the 3rd week of their stroke to talk about how sexuality might be difficult for them. And the preferred mode of delivery was one-to-one or in a group with a health professional, some online and some written information. For the people with aphasia, health professional only. They knew that they wouldn't be able to read some of the stuff. So we're coming to the end now. So we're trying to look now at going, okay, well, that's great. We've got to really see if the measures that are out there can be feasible to use with the stroke population and adapted for people with aphasia. We need to see whether or not what we've come up with is going to be feasible to deliver in an inpatient setting. And so we're commencing that pilot soon to try and see how this goes. And I think that a lot of our measures will not be that person suddenly has a brilliant sex life, and now their quality of life has gone through the roof. We don't expect much to change in the inpatient setting. We would be happy if the process-based measures, such as the person felt comfortable to raise it with someone on the team, the person knew where they could go after they were discharged to get help. That to me is what we might reasonably expect, which is why I reckon that other Australian study might have not got what they thought they would have got from that 30 minutes and that one sheet of paper. So I'm just leaving you here with one of our very, very important colleagues, Caroline, who has worked with us, and she had a stroke, and she just really brings home that she articulates extremely well the difficulty that caused her, and that no healthcare professional really asked her about her sexuality at all. And so I think that we have a job to do. Loneliness is pervasive, and it is a really important factor in all-cause mortality. And I think that we need to help, we need to step up now, but clinicians need help to do that. The key messages are that sexuality is more than sex. Think broadly. Be aware of your own values and beliefs. You may be transmitting them unconsciously, as we mostly do. Healthcare professionals need to break the silence though, but we need to have protocols and scripts to help people feel comfortable to say the things that they need to say. And also not to feel bad if someone says, oh, no, that's stupid. Okay, it's not personal. Okay. We need to be able to give people easy ways to give permission and limited information, scripts for clinicians, and we need to include people with communication impairments and people who identify as sexual minorities. We tried to get cultural and linguistic diverse and sexual minority populations in our Delphi study. Weren't very successful. We're much more successful in getting aphasia, and that's saying something. So, and we need to get onward referral pathways, and that has become what I think a better situation for mental health because of the stroke guidelines in mental health. Now it's more clear about, well, if someone has severe mood issues, then there's places to go. But for this topic, it's still not clear what the pathways are. So what I've got in here, and I know this has been a bit of a whirlwind, there's some references. There's the resources, which is the Stroke Foundation fact sheet. If you want to have discussions around this in a aphasia-friendly way, there's information you can purchase from a Canadian Aphasia Institute that we used. Always remember that there is the Sexuality Intimacy Clinic, which Sandra Lever is leading. And there's Erin. the next person. So that's what I had today. So thank you very much for listening, and it was really good to be able to talk about this stuff. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. Before we pass on to our next speaker next month, we've got Slido ready to bring up. We've got some lovely entries from our audience members.
Excellent.
Who have not shied away from the topic.
Well, good on them.
Indeed. Okay, so feel free to read those out.
Okay, so the first question is, speech pathologists in the top 2 professions having,
Oh, let's jump up.
I don't know about that answer. I'll talk to Sandra. Sandra, are you on? I don't know if you're on, but I imagine that you'd be able to contact Sandra, and she would be able to determine whether or not it's feasible to provide that service remotely. Speech pathologists in the top 2 professionals having these conversations, but the lowest in reported knowledge. Well, let's say reported knowledge. Reported knowledge. Is it good speech pathologists are giving it a go or worrying because they've got low knowledge? I suspect they have low knowledge and that they may not be giving it a very big go. It may be that when they do, it is tailored to specifics around their expertise in relation to communication. I think it's positive if people are able to raise it at a permission level or even a limit in information, and then that the speech pathologist has a place to refer. Often with people with communication impairment, they're only going to raise it with speech pathologists because no one else is talking to them in that way. So we have to remember that as an interdisciplinary team, the speech pathologist may be key in the same way they might be in mental health, in dealing with people with communication impairment, and to prepare them to address the issue and to have places then to say, okay, team, I've fielded these questions, now where to next? How do we account for speech pathologists from different cultural, religious backgrounds? How can we be sensitive to them and their views while also using best practice? This is in debate at the moment in the Religious Discrimination Bill, and whether or not people are able to refuse service. This is not exactly that issue, but I think this is particularly challenging, and I suppose if you flipped it around and said, should we be sensitive to people? I think as a health professional, you have to deal with what's in front of you. And you have to work out, you don't have to change who you are, but you need to be able to understand what your values are and how that works for you and what the implications can be for the person in front of you, and to be able to manage that for that person in the way that they need as a person-centered therapist. For some people that is referring on in some areas, and for others it would be getting support and help to do that. But I would be concerned if we were thinking that for some of our professionals, because of aspects about their personal factors, that then stroke survivors would have to get a different service or a value-laden service. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that just works for religion. I think there's lots of aspects about that. And I think that that's the challenging thing, is when morality comes into it, we can almost make this an exception, which we can't do with many topics. And so I think we've got to have conversations about that. I think that's more important than the sensitivities in themselves. I think we should be very sensitive to people who have different views, but I think we should support them in managing how they're going to affect patients in relation to that. And that includes me for other things, you know. Is there anywhere health professionals can, sorry, I'm just having trouble reading that.
Go for
upskilling. I thought it said upkilling, but that wouldn't make any sense. Well, we have been doing, the Sydney Sexuality Group has been doing some workshops. We've found them to be really highly attended because no one is really talking about this. But yes, that's something that we need to do. I suppose what is challenging for us and what you saw then is that I don't have an efficacious intervention to quickly, easily offer you. I've got things to think about. We obviously have evidence that we believe it's a good practice to do this, but we don't have an easy way to upskill, knowing what works and targeting the exact barriers that people have. It's not about education, because it might be about how do we change. If it's education only fixes knowledge or skill, it helps with skill, but what about if attitudes are the issue? And so then you have to use a different behavioural change technique, which would be something like persuasion, which would mean getting a credible person, like a person with stroke, saying, it really damaged me not to be able to think about that. And I really would value staff being courageous and opening up the conversation with me. Okay, so that's actually targeting someone to persuade them that they need to do that. The person knows that they need to do it, but there's something stopping them. So I think that what we need to do is try and think about the multiple ways in this complex thing that we can help professionals. And I think we haven't got a neat package to do yet, but we certainly would encourage any health professional to talk to our group so that you could gain sort of individual upskilling, and we can then talk further about what we can do to help. Seem very similar values, beliefs, behaviours between sexuality and advanced care planning. Yes. Can we transfer lessons learned for interventions and improve practice? That would be great. I think what you have hit on, Anonymous, is, the issue of difficult conversations. We've been talking about that in the Graduate School of Health with Ian Kneebone and Brooke Bryan from UQ in relation to the fact that there's a lot of a parallel. When I've been doing research in our mental health RCT, cluster RCT for mood, what I found is some parallel stories about, when we had permission, when we knew what to say and where we could send the people, we were more likely to raise it. So I think that there are some great parallels there, and that sometimes it might not be even the topic, it might be the nature of the topic that requires people to have a certain type of support in order to continue that topic. And it's, I think about having scripts and also about reinforcement. Some of the literature says, actually, when I've raised it with people, I've almost had no one that didn't want to talk about it or that didn't politely say no. So I think emotion is there. You know, people are worried about getting a bad reaction from people as well. So yes, I think that's great. What do you think about people not already involved in relationships? We just ignore them, basically. Intimate partner, but have to navigate 20th century world of dating. It's pretty difficult, although for some people, the technology facilitates a different kind of intimacy opportunity. We found in the research, unmarried people didn't exist. Sorry, you don't get any help. And the world of dating is something that is fundamental. So I think we could borrow from brain injury. They are, because of the age range, they're more focused on that and moving towards that. But I certainly think that we need to, that's why it's a multidisciplinary thing. We need to support people in how do you engage in these the genres of communication, and with the technology that enables that communication, and swipe right or left. That's what I've heard. I don't know about those, perhaps. Maybe raise these topics part of the discharge plan for everyone. Yes, I think that would be fantastic. So putting it into systems is one of the best ways in terms of implementation that we can ensure that something gets embedded into local practice. I do know a lot of, some of the stroke services, when people are discharged and they come into day hospitals, have it as one of the questions on the questionnaire. Would you like any further, to talk further about sexuality? So that's somewhere as well that we could do it. I think that's a great idea. So discharge, but you need to know where they can go after the discharge, and so you have to be confident that you can do that, and we need to help. We need to help services do that.
Yes.
Are we done?
We're done. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Especially to Emma.
Oh, no.
And also to